Here is a question that tends to get lost in the conversation about AI and jobs. Everyone is talking about which jobs AI will take, which industries will be disrupted, which workers are most at risk. The conversation is almost entirely focused on the supply side, on what happens to the people who produce things. Almost nobody is asking about the demand side, because the people whose jobs are being replaced are not just workers. They are also consumers. They buy groceries, pay rent, purchase cars, book holidays, and spend money in ways that keep the rest of the economy running. If AI displaces workers at the scale that some projections suggest, and those workers do not have alternative sources of income, then the companies deploying AI to cut their labor costs are simultaneously reducing the pool of people who can afford to buy what they produce. That is the demand problem. And it is one of the most important economic questions that the AI conversation is not adequately addressing. To understand why this matters, start with a basic principle of how economies work. Modern economies are circular. Companies produce goods and services. Workers receive wages for producing them. Those wages become the spending power that allows workers, as consumers, to buy the goods and services that other companies produce. Production creates income. Income creates demand. Demand sustains production. The circle completes itself. Henry Ford understood this in a way that many of his contemporaries did not. He paid his workers wages high enough that they could afford to buy the cars they were building. Not out of generosity, out of a clear-eyed recognition that the market for his product depended on the purchasing power of people like his workers. The problem AI introduces into this system is straightforward. When a company replaces a worker with an AI system, it reduces its costs and keeps more revenue. For that company, in the short term, this is unambiguously good for its finances. But it has also removed a wage from the economy. A wage that was being spent on goods and services produced by other companies. If this happens at one company in one industry, the macroeconomic effect is negligible. If it happens simultaneously across many companies in many industries, as AI adoption at scale would imply, the aggregate effect on consumer demand becomes significant. The efficiency gains captured by individual companies come at the cost of the consumer spending that sustains the markets those companies sell into. That is the demand problem in its simplest form. The most discussed policy response to this problem is universal basic income. The idea that every citizen should receive a regular, unconditional payment from the government regardless of employment status. The economic logic is straightforward. If AI displaces workers at scale and those workers cannot find alternative employment quickly enough, some mechanism for maintaining consumer purchasing power becomes a necessity. Without it, the demand problem eventually becomes a demand crisis. A UBI ensures that displaced workers retain some purchasing power. That purchasing power continues flowing through the economy as consumer spending. The companies whose automation created the displacement continue to have a market to sell into. The circular flow of the economy is maintained. The challenges are equally straightforward. A genuinely universal, basic income at a level sufficient to maintain meaningful purchasing power would be extraordinarily expensive. Funding it requires significantly higher taxes on income, on wealth, or on the productivity gains captured by companies deploying AI. The distributional effects of different funding mechanisms matter enormously. A consumption tax that funds UBI can end up taking more from lower-income households than they receive back. There are also genuine questions about work incentives. Critics argue that guaranteed income reduces motivation to seek employment. The evidence from pilot programs is more nuanced. Reductions in labor participation have generally been modest, and in many cases, people who reduced working hours did so to pursue education or caregiving that has long-term economic value, even when it does not show up as formal employment. UBI is not a settled answer. It is a serious question that the scale of AI displacement may eventually force economies to answer whether they want to or not. So who buys anything when AI takes all the jobs? The honest answer is that it depends entirely on choices that have not yet been made. How the productivity gains from AI are distributed. What policy mechanisms are put in place to maintain consumer purchasing power? How quickly new sources of employment emerge to replace those being displaced? The optimistic scenario is that AI creates sufficient new categories of work while raising productivity enough that the same level of consumption can be maintained. In this scenario, the demand problem is temporary, absorbed by the economy's normal adjustment mechanisms over years. The more concerning scenario is that the scale and speed of AI displacement exceeds the economy's capacity to adjust. That productivity gains flow primarily to a narrow group of asset owners. And that consumer purchasing power, the foundation of the circular economy, contracts significantly. An economy built on consumer spending has very little resilience when the consumer runs dry. The question of who buys anything when AI does the work is not a futurist thought experiment. It is an economic question with real answers. Answers that will be determined by policy choices made over the next decade. Getting those answers right may be the most consequential economic challenge of the generation. At Macro Breakdown, we break down the economic forces shaping the world, clearly and without the noise. If this video gave you something to think about, subscribe and we will keep covering the stories that matter. Drop any questions in the comments below.